Okay, I will then introduce our second senior, Mr. Matthew Gormley. Welcome to the podium.
Hi, guys. Okay, so I'd like you to imagine with me something for a second. Imagine that book is every fact about cats and dogs you could ever know about. Cats versus dogs, which is better and everything like that. And this would be a book on how cats act. Obviously, it's a bad book, not a good one. Now let's say this is the only one that's given to you. Somebody who has plenty of cats, or plenty of dogs, I apologize, gives you this book about every bad way that a cat acts. And they try and cover all those up for me. What's the idea that you're going to have about cats? You're going to think, they're evil. They're terrible little things. I'm going to get a dog, even though you don't know very much about a dog. That's the basis for what I like to call educational manipulation. Educational manipulation is the restriction of or alteration of particular information given to often students, but it can be anybody learning about anything. Educational manipulation can take several different kinds of forms in schools in particular. And those two ways are formal and informal educational manipulation. Formal being mandated by higher powers such as government, and informal being teachers, like a more personal basis. Formal educational manipulation being mandated by the government is very subtle and impersonal and often takes roots in textbooks and worksheets. Oftentimes it consists of large assumptions hidden under statements of fact. And I have an example from a biology book called Miller and Levine Biology from freshman year, which I forgot to give back to Mrs. Theory. The quote is talking about mutations, and it says, "Mutations are often thought of as negative since they can disrupt the normal function of genes. However, without mutations, specifically beneficial ones, organisms could not evolve because mutations are the source of genetic variability in a species." The first part of that statement is a true statement of fact. Mutations are often thought of as negative. That's fine to say. However, they go on to say, without beneficial mutations, organisms could not evolve because mutations are the source of genetic variability in a species. That's the statement of assumption. They're assuming that evolution is true and trying to say beneficial mutation has to take place in order for evolution to be true. But it's hard for freshman students to see this, of course. And I would also like to mention that they give no examples of beneficial mutations on the next page. They only talk about negative, non-beneficial mutations. So that's what formal educational manipulation looks like. Informal is more based on the teachers. The teachers oftentimes withhold information. They don't allow discussion about opposing worldviews to what they're teaching. Compared to formal educational manipulation, it's oftentimes a lot more blunt because of these, and because of the more personal nature of it. They also do things, I know college professors are notorious for lowering the grades of papers if they don't line up with that professor's worldview. So there's something that educational manipulation often employs, and to see this we have to discuss two different forms of reasoning, inductive versus deductive reasoning. Deductive reasoning is what's called the top-down method. You start with a theory and you look for facts to match that theory. Inductive reasoning is the bottom-up method, where you have some facts and you try to formulate a theory based off of that. And William M.K. Trochim says, "Inductive reasoning by its very nature is more open-ended and exploratory, especially at the beginning. Deductive reasoning is more narrow in nature and is concerned with testing or confirming hypotheses." And I have an example of deductive reasoning being used in educational manipulation, again in Miller and Levine Biology, page 539. They say, by comparing structures in fossils, a backbone, for example, to body structures in living organisms, researchers can infer evolutionary relationships and form hypotheses about how body structures and species have evolved. Again, the first part of that quote is, it's okay, it's a fact statement. By comparing structures in living fossils to body structures in living organisms. Actually, that doesn't say anything, never mind. But the second part of the statement, this is my point, researchers can infer evolutionary relationships and form hypotheses about how body structures and species have evolved. Again, they're starting with the assumption of evolution and looking for facts to fit that. And it's worded that way. That's a good example of deductive reasoning. A good example of inductive reasoning would be the scientific theory, which Miller and Levine biology claims to use quite extensively, but when looking at statements like these, that's evidently not true. So this is what educational manipulation, formal and informal, looks like. What does a good education without it look like? A good education should be one where facts are taught as facts and theories are discussed openly. This is important for developing adolescent minds of, say, our freshmen and sophomore students, even all the way up through seniors in college. It teaches them, or a good education should teach them how to think, not teach them what they should know. So, bringing it back to our examples, they're not like Miller and Levine Biology 375. They don't give any examples of beneficial mutations. They just tell them that beneficial mutations must occur for species to evolve. That doesn't teach a student how to think, and especially since they don't give any counter-arguments, or they don't give room for counter-arguing this. Again, it's all about, they're teaching, or they're telling students what they should know. Anyways, on the formal side, a good education should be, again, based on fact, not on assumption of theory, as we saw in Miller and Levine Biology 375, the first example, and should be based on inductive, not deductive reasoning. On the informal side, teachers should be open to challenge and discussion. They should practice unbiased grading, and they should give students a good idea about the entire picture, not just select bits of information. So what are the dangers of educational manipulation? What can it allow people to do? Essentially, it gives people the power to control others' belief. A good example of this is in Brave New World. In Brave New World, Chapter 2, we see examples of when students are asleep, they play a speaker underneath the pillow, and that's how they learn. This is a way of teaching them things like, again, telling them what they know, not how to think. They have no direct schooling, and this is the only way that they learn. This essentially removes choice without letting people know that their choice has been removed. So, ought we or ought not we employ educational manipulation in our schools, even if it's towards something that's true? We have to ask the question, to answer this, we have to ask the question, do the ends justify the means? But how do we know that the means are immoral in the first place? In our moral philosophy class with Mr. Theory, we as a class came to the conclusion that it's immoral to take away people's choice. People ought to have the right to choose, even if they're choosing the wrong thing. And educational manipulation, again, it takes away their choice without letting them know that their choice has been taken away. In this case, on what to believe. So, how do we solve educational manipulation since I've discussed how it can be dangerous, how it's immoral? How do we solve it? On the formal side, to solve it, you have to remove government regulations. That's the first step in solving educational manipulation. What this does is it allows people to teach by their own biases. And this can sound like a backward step, but in the words of Janie B. Cheney in her article, "Scientism is no basis for sound education or a healthy society," she says, "But better a democracy of scattered falsehoods than a tyranny of one gigantic lie." So it's better to have a lot of people teaching based on their own biases than one system dictating how everybody should teach in the first place. But this doesn't fix the informal side. The informal side is based much more on human nature, and human nature is something which is very difficult to uproot. However, there's something that the student can do about it if they try hard enough and they learn what's happening if they learn how they're being taught. What they can do is they can cross-reference multiple beliefs. Again, assuming that formal educational manipulation is not there. The government's not mandating that anything should be taught. Is that my timer? Where'd my train of thought?
Go ahead and finish.
Okay. Wow, it's gone. Hold on.
Formal
This is an example.
Formal
education isn't being enforced. In other words, how do you correct
Right.
informal?
As long as formal manipulation is not being enforced by the government, you can cross-reference lots of teachers together. Say you have 2 separate teachers in one school, you can go to each of them and see what they have to say on a particular subject. Cross-referencing is the best thing you can do. Looking at different textbooks, different sources, doing your own research. That's how you can solve informal educational manipulation for yourself. That is all I have. In conclusion, I guess, educational manipulation is immoral. It's happening a lot in our society today, in our schools, in our public schools, but there's something we can do about it.
I'll go ahead and kick off the questioning again. Thank you for your presentation and your very coherent outline. That was helpful. Truth versus manipulation. What would you say to someone who argues that truth is what I can get other people to think?
So, can you state the question?
Well, that I'm not manipulating them to a particular truth because there isn't any truth. Truth is what I can get them to think. So it's not bad if they don't think A, because it doesn't really matter in the end.
Right. So I think that goes back to what I discussed earlier, which is ought we or ought not we use educational manipulation to guide students to truth. I think regardless of where you're guiding them, whether that be truth or not, or anything in between that you might believe, I think that educational manipulation is the wrong way of going about that. Not only because, again, it doesn't teach people how to think, it teaches them what they know, as well as it's, going back to, it is immoral, as we, as a senior class, decided, taking away that choice of theirs, saying you don't have the choice to believe what you want. I'm going to kind of manipulate you into believing what I want you to believe, and that's wrong.
I like Janie B. Cheney a lot, and her quote that there are scattered falsehoods that we can. So I look at one side of that quote and say, okay, government regulations are there for a reason. Can you ascribe any goodwill to oversight to try to maybe level the field of education? You might have a real knowledgeable teacher over here and not so knowledgeable one over there, and if that not so knowledgeable one is scattering a lot of falsehoods, that might be a detriment overall to our society. Can you give the benefit of the doubt? I'm kind of playing the devil's advocate just a little bit to the oversight to kind of keep the scattered falsehoods. And can you give what example, and maybe your 2 examples, you see as a scattered falsehood?
So first of all, I think that society would be in a much better place with lots of scattered falsehoods and a few points of truth, rather than the government instituting anything, saying, you must teach this. I think that's much worse than even a society that's surrounded by mostly falsehoods. Just because even in that case, there are still places that you can go to find other sources of information, whereas if the government is mandating something, the teacher's not necessarily allowed to talk about that, in a classroom. They can do it outside of the classroom, of course. That was the first part of your question. What's the second bit?
No, that's good. I think you answered it.
Okay.
So in a sense, would you say that choice is more important? I'm tempted to ask, because I hear you saying this, in what sense, or in every sense, would you say that choice is more important than truth? Because I hear you, or you can refute that. No, that's not what you're saying, but that it's more important that someone chooses X even if X is false. That they have that opportunity to choose X, and we can be more satisfied in our humanity somehow if that person chose X, which is false, compared to Y, which is true, because they had the choice. That was more important than making sure they chose Y, which is true. Assuming that can be established, but that's not the point of your paper.
Yes, I believe that's. What I'm saying is, yes, we're in a better standpoint in society if somebody is allowed to choose something false. They're allowed to choose something false rather than having to be forced to choose something right. Either being forced or being manipulated that way.
Because you said it's immoral to take that choice away.
It's immoral to take that choice away.
I'm just going to play off of this and put a little wrench in the works. Young children, you are a senior. Giving you a choice seems sensible because you can distinguish between things. But what about an elementary schooler? You give them a choice, how are they going to know what to decide unless you as a teacher guide them? Now, guiding sounds like manipulation.
I think in the younger years, I'm not sure that there's enough that you can teach them for them to be able to understand that really requires that kind of choice, that kind of, big, belief. They can't form their own beliefs yet. And I don't think there's anything in, elementary and kindergarten and things of that sort that they would have to choose something like that. That's really weird wording.
So they're not faced with significant moral choices, maybe, or any? Right.
Yes. I don't think they're faced with those significant moral choices yet, such as what to believe, say, like evolution versus creation, for example. I think religion-wise, that's for the parents to decide. But even if those elementary schoolers had to be faced with some of those, I think there's still some ways to teach those things without being biased, making them have to choose something yet. You can still teach more on a basis of fact rather than a basis of, twisting it, manipulating it.
So first of all, very interesting topic. Also, you're a great speaker, so well done. I'm also going to play devil's advocate a little bit. With most types of manipulation, sometimes you don't know that you're being manipulated, especially when it can be coming from very convincing and educated voices of academic reason. Right. So one of the suggestions you gave was that to fight that academic manipulation, you should cross-reference kind of what you're learning in class. Mm-hmm. Well, in the context of time is finite, and maybe you're not aware that you're being manipulated, What then is your recommendation to the manipulated student? If they don't know they're being manipulated, they don't have the time really to cross-reference, that kind of thing.
If they don't know that they're being manipulated, then I'm actually not sure.
Maybe how you could be on guard against manipulation, perhaps?
Skepticism, perhaps, maybe approaching all class.
Doubt everything.
Skepticism.
Some degree of skepticism is always a good thing to take with you, and look for some things in the examples that I showed. Definitely can be very hard to see if somebody who's really good at teaching is teaching you. But those same sort of things, larger value truth statements hidden under statements of fact, and definitely places where they use inductive versus deductive reasoning. Those are good things to look for.
And we've mentioned logical contradiction as an objective way of...
So Don, a cloak of skepticism.
Yeah.
Skepticism
is always good.
Something that has to be taught.
One more question?
More?
You want to take another one for me?
Sure.
Okay.
Darwin.
A couple of things came to mind. One was out of Stephen Meyer's book, Darwin's Doubt. I wish I knew the name of the Chinese geologist / evolutionary biologist who looks at the shale deposits in China and does not see evidence for a progressive amount of, the appearance of body plans during the Cambrian explosion. And he's criticizing the Darwinian view, and he can do that in China. And his quote was, "In my country, we can criticize Darwin, but in your country, but not the government. But in your country, you can criticize the government, but not Darwin." So, but another kind of tagging on to that, we just heard a quote by a group of, I don't know if it was the Atheist Society, but they want to wipe out homeschooling in our country because their quote was, "We can't let them teach our nation's children." And so what would you say to a person if they were sitting here in this room and saying, "We can't let them teach our nation's children," how would you convince them that they have a right to
Homeschool.
to homeschool? Yes, to homeschool.
Yeah.
Yes. So freedom in education to them looks like a huge detriment to our country. So what would you say to them?
And you might say they're absolutely correct.
No. I think with the current state of our government and how they mandate certain things to be taught using, say, Common Core, that's a really good question.
Well, when
We talked a little bit about choice before.
seems
It's just-
related to Ms. Kilgore's question about parents. So where does that leave off and then the free choice of humanity?
Yeah.
I tried to lead you into maybe some of the thinking about as far as the criticizing of the government in China. Do you see a kind of a parallel there in
Choices. Let's brought up a point in class about choice of school at one point, I recall.
Choice of school.
When we were talking about the evolutionary teacher, creation teacher.
Right.
When we talked about the problem with that, you said it's
Yeah.
important to have choice. You could do the school if you want to.
And I bring up the
Right.
question because it's in the news right now. People are trying to wipe out completely the choice of having autonomy over your own education. So this is a very pertinent subject.
Yeah, so that is further removing people's choice. I think it's good for you to be able to choose what school you can go to, and like what's after homeschooling? Are they going to take away private schools as well, and then charter schools after that? If you can't choose which school you can go to, then you have no choice about who's teaching you. And with the government currently in public schools mandating Common Core and saying you're not allowed to teach these certain subjects, that is, it takes away their choice. You know.
Back to the book idea.
It's
Back to the book idea.
yeah, it was their choice. You know, you're saying this is the only thing, and none of that. That doesn't matter. Don't.
You're
don't
saying
go
his brown
over
shirt
it.
way is the only way, basically.
Yeah. So it's more academically and intellectually honest.
All right, thank you.
Very nice.
I hear that cats actually act like that sometimes.